I think some people are still joining, but we will get started. So I am Jeff Bryan. I'm the executive director and co-founder at the Positivity Project, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Mike is going to talk about leading in a remote environment. Mike's got a lot of experience with this. As the co-founder of the Positivity Project, we're a fully remote team, and also the founder and executive director at Team Red, White, and Blue, which is also a remote team. There it is. There's the eagle with members and staff members spread out all across the country. So they got multiple time zones, all that stuff. So what Mike's going to focus on today is leadership as a relationship, and how do you build those relationships over a large distance, working with remote teams, and how do you keep people motivated and inspired to do the important work that they need to do from a distance. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. So a couple of things. First of all, I'm not sure if Ed Wolf is here, but I'm drinking coffee out of my Positivity Project mug here. So
no, Ed, sorry, Mike. Ed emailed me. His son is doing a 10-mile hike today for Boy Scouts, so he wasn't going to be able to be here.
Outstanding. That's number one. Number two, I'm friends with some of you on Facebook, so you know this, but so Team Red, White, and Blue, our focus is really around veterans and physical activity and mental and physical health. And so I'm doing this thing today. Jeremy Mitchell joined, by the way, Positivity Project principal, who's the one who inspired this. So every hour today from sunrise this morning, which was at 6:22. So I kicked off at 6:20. I run 1 mile, do 5 pull-ups, 10 push-ups, and 15 air squats every hour. Basically for the whole day, from sunrise until sunset. So that's why I'm looking a little bit sweaty. And when we're done here, I'll be jumping back on the trail to do some more running. Part of the incentive is it's a fundraiser, and I have pledged that if we raise $10,000, that I'm going to turn my hair, which is extremely long right now, into a mohawk, or I guess they call it a faux hawk. So it's like kind of like a mohawk. So I'll do it for at least, I don't know, maybe a day. We'll see how long I can take it. So with that being said, I'm really excited to talk about this topic, because as Jeff said, something that I've been studying a lot. I've also practiced a lot. To be very clear, this doesn't mean that I got it figured out, right? Leading in a remote environment is especially difficult. There's a lot of factors that come into play. And I want to spend a little time thinking through the lens of, hey, how do our relationships, which, by the way, you've built, right, in person with your staff, right, with your colleagues over, the school year, and in many cases, like years, how can you use that as the foundational building block to be able to lead through this chaotic time? So as the background, so as Jeff knows, right, so Jeff does this as well, right, so the Positivity Project is distributed and remote, and a lot of part-time employees and staff. The Team Red, White, and Blue is 24 full-time staff, 4 or 5 contractors, and we're across all different time zones from Alaska to Florida. And so there is just a lot to this, and I think it's just worth sharing some slides with you. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. So I hate oversharing slides, but I think it's probably important to kind of walk through some of the lens at how I think we should consider approaching this. All right. So a couple of key themes, right? Number one, I want to talk about leadership in general, right? And whether you're a principal, assistant superintendent, a counselor, a teacher, it doesn't really matter. Like, you are in like a massive leadership role. And if you didn't believe that pre-COVID, then certainly I think you realize that now, that there are a lot of people looking to you for guidance and direction in this very uncertain time. We're going to talk real briefly about the accessibility that people have to us. And while that can be a good thing, all the downsides to it, right? We're going to talk about briefly touch on this idea of good decision-making, and then we're going to talk about relationships. So what is the starting point for the complexity of leadership? Well, first of all, I kind of break it down into 3 major things. Number one, you need to be able to know yourself, right? So we all have our own strengths and weaknesses, our values, our long-term visions of what we want to do in this profession or in the world. And so, right off the bat, it's hard to be able to understand yourself. This is something that takes a lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of time, okay? But then you need to be able to lead the people, or you need to be able to understand the people that you lead. So you start thinking about, okay, all these various people that you lead, how do you like know them? How do you know what their strengths are? How do you know what their weaknesses are? How do you know like when they're going through tough times? And then lastly, and this gets specifically to the core of COVID right now, you need to be able to analyze the situation you're in, because leadership often fluctuates drastically from situation to situation. So the example from the military would be that you often had soldiers in a garrison environment, in, let's say, Fort Bragg or Fort Hood, Texas, and then you basically like had them in that situation, then in a deployment zone in Iraq. And what you would often see is that like they acted and behaved and needed very different things from you from the States to a combat zone. Right. And I think that this same thing applies true for you now as you're thinking about it. Like the support that your colleagues, that your staff, if you're a principal, like or a counselor and you're supporting a whole bunch of different staff, the support that people need, right, is very different. Right. And you need to be able to understand that I think as you sort of think through the framework of how you approach leading in a remote environment. Okay. So more on the complexity. Need I say any more? COVID-19, right? Last time we talked about this, really kind of identified this as, what I kind of called like the enemy, right? Like COVID-19 and the impact of this really has caused such chaos in this VUCA environment, right? Volatile, uncertain, chaotic, and ambiguous. This has added tons of fuel onto the already hot burning fire of leadership and the challenges of leading in the information age that we live in. Right. So we already know this, right, in our personal lives. This is certainly true as well in our professional lives, as educators. But like there's just so much noise. There's so much stuff coming at people. So you think about your own personal life and how you filter that out and how you manage that. Then you think about the people that you lead and that you love. How are they filtering it out? How are they paying? Like, what do they pay attention to? What do they ignore? What do they sort of set to the side and say, I need to come back to this tomorrow? Right. It really starts to increase the complexity in a major way. Right. So I talk about this a lot when I give like book talks on the book that I co-author, Lead Yourself First. But right, there's a couple of key things I think that we need to know about ourselves and about the people that we lead. This is not universally true, but these are general statements that are I have found over and over again to be accurate. Right, number one, people are tethered to their smartphones, and they're not really phones. They are computers that allow us to take pictures and take videos, access our bank account, check the weather, check our email. Right, so for most of us, they are like right there. They are an extension like of our hand, and we cannot find ourselves without them. That then allows people to be able to check email at all hours of the night. So again, I'm starting to paint a picture for the framework around the complexity of leading in a remote environment, because when you're in the same school building with people, when you're in the same office space with people, you can lead in a different way because like people are in front of you, right? And you're in the meeting and you can look them in the eyes and all that. But like this is why, for example, using Zoom is so powerful versus just like a phone call, because people are significantly more engaged, as Zoom has proven with their own data analytics, that people are much more engaged because they know that someone might be looking at them, right? Or someone might have a question, they can look them and see them in the eyes, right? We talk about all the distractions of life, the push notifications, the text messaging, right? The phone calls, like all of this like is inbound stuff that we have to sort of think through, sift, and then see, okay, what do I need to pay attention to right now? What can I pay attention to later? And what is frankly noise that I don't really need in my life right now? And then of course you stack on and you layer on top of this social media, right? And so people see how other people are processing and handling and living through the COVID times. So there's a powerful frame of reference here. And some of you who've been to my leadership seminar have seen me and heard me talk about this before, but it's called the Eisenhower Box. And it was popularized by Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But really it came from General/President Eisenhower. And this becomes, I think, more important than ever. If you remember last week, we talked about like how time is just less structured now in a remote environment, right? Like there's just more space in the given day that people are going to use in a way that works for them or makes the most sense for them. Sure, I'm sure teachers got standard Zoom calls at certain periods of time and all that, right? But ultimately there is just more unstructured time about when they're going to grade their papers, when they're going to give feedback, when they're going to lesson plan, right? All of that, it all has to be done in a fluid motion with their personal lives, which if it includes educating your own children, right? That's just layers the complexity on. So more than ever, I think it's critical to think really aggressively about how you're spending your time. And what Eisenhower suggested is there's really kind of like almost like a 2x2 matrix, right? Is it important or not? And is it urgent or not? Right? Urgent being like, does it need to be done like in the immediacy by a certain period of time, or can it wait? Right? And then important is essentially like, what's the consequence, right? Like, what is the consequence if I don't do this? In other words, glass ball versus rubber ball, right? We've heard this phrase before, I'm sure, but right, rubber balls, they can drop, they bounce, you can go chase them. Glass balls, can't drop them, right? Glass balls, you drop them, the ball's gone. And that's a really, really big problem. Okay, so the real brief recommendation here about how to think about this is ultimately, right, if it's a crisis, if it's like a deadline and it needs to get done, like you got to do it, right? But this, to be clear, is not a great place to live. Things that are urgent, but not that important, like for example, this right here would fall under this, right? This is like scheduled at 2:00 Eastern. And if you're here live right now, it would be urgent and that like you have to be here. But like, look, if you miss this, are you going to continue to go on with your daily life? Of course you are, right? We like to think that, and hopefully the participation here shows that like we're adding value through these conversations and these discussions. But the reality is like, if it does not happen, if you happen to miss this, this Zoom chat, like things would go on. Right? Things that are not urgent but important, box 2. Those things you need to schedule. So as you think about how you structure out your day and how you help the people that you lead structure out their day, it's really critical that, from a scheduling standpoint, that you give them the space and the time for some of those things that are really important, but they're just not urgent. One simple piece of advice I've been saying to people a lot, and again, this is hard to even practice for myself, but look, you want to pick up the phone and call someone and say, what's up? Great. Okay. But problematic, right, is if you sit there and say, hey, you know what? We need to like throw on like an all hands meeting in 2 hours, right? Or whatever it might be. I think you want to try to avoid those like big, like we all have to do this in 2 hours or in 3 hours kind of decisions to the very best of your ability, realizing there may be some time when something happens that it needs to occur, right? So again, schedule things and empower people to be able to schedule those things like relationship building, like planning, right? Put it in their schedule so they know when they can plan for it, right? Again, this is harder than ever, especially when you're living personal and professional lives out of the same household. Right. And then lastly and this is probably the most important place for you to start, is how can you get rid of the things, especially right now in this time, that are not urgent and not important. And you heard me say this last time I talked about the idea of there's a difference between like watching Netflix or playing a video game or doing something like that to kind of like put it all down. There's a difference between that and then doing it ad nauseum to numb the frustration and the anxiety and the stress that you feel, right? And this is especially something that a lot of people and a lot of, we already know that like a lot of people in our society do this, right? They turn to those things that are not urgent, not important, and they kind of pass the time by doing that. And so it's really critical as you think about, how you're spending your time right now to maximize the impact of that time. And again, this is just a final slide on this topic is our challenge really is to grow box 2, right? And you grow box 2 by cutting out box 4, right? And when you grow box 2, then you have fewer emergencies. Box 1 gets smaller. Box 3 gets smaller, right? The magic of life is really in how many hours in a given day can you give to box 2 stuff. Things that are important but not urgent. Well-being, taking care of yourself, self-care, right? Planning, meditation, reflection, prayer, relationships, eating healthy, all those kinds of things. They all are frankly not important, are important but not urgent. And if you don't do them today or tomorrow or the next day, it's not a big deal. The problem becomes when they compound day after day after day, and you now have established bad habits of not exercising, of eating unhealthy, of not getting enough sleep, of not taking care of yourself, right? That's when the compounding effect is when it becomes very painful because you set in new habits. So again, this is not just about you, this is about the people that you lead. How are you helping them to think through? And we're happy to send these slides out if you find them useful and you want them to help you to kind of have this conversation, with the people that you lead. But I think it's really critical to focus in on this. How do you grow box 2, especially in this time? Right. So a couple of key things in this as well, right? 2 steps in the right direction. One of my mentors talked about this a lot. Create a stop doing list. So what are all the things that you've started to do in the COVID times, right? Maybe initially because you had to, because there was all this pressure, but now you find yourself 5-6 weeks later still doing certain bad habits, right? Certain things that are ineffective. Like literally sit down and think about what those are, put them down on paper and say, you know what, I need to stop doing this. I need to stop doing this. I need to stop doing this, right? And then when you do that, that gives you time back that you can then repurpose in a different way. I read a great article just the other day about this, but talks about 10 reasons why you should get up at 5 a.m. Right. And I have not been getting up at 5 a.m. recently. There was periods in my life when I did, and now I get up at 6, but that's a valuable hour, right? So I'm starting to get back to some of those practices, but you can only do that by saying, you know what, I'm going to stop staying up until 11:30 at night, right? I got to get to bed by 10:30 at night so that I can get up at 5. And then number 2, this is really important. You got to get better at saying no, right? There's going to be, tons of asks of your time as you already feel this pressure from parents, from colleagues, from people that work for you, all that, right? There are certain things that you just have to be able to say no to. And I love this slide right here, right? You can, with the palette of warm colors in the background, right? You can still be a warm, loving person and still say no. It just takes practice, right? There's a huge difference here between saying no to everything because you want to look out for yourself versus saying no to lots of things out there so that you can be better and a better leader and a better spouse and a better parent and a better friend and a better family member for everybody else, right? You need to be able to know what you need to say yes to, right? And what you need to say no to. But this is really hard, especially for people out there. If I was in the same room with you, I'd say, hey, who here's a people pleaser, right? There's a lot of people, right, who have a servant's heart that are people pleasers, and it gets really tough to be able to say no effectively, but it's really, really critical that you do it, especially at this time. All right, so pivoting and moving on to this other idea here, right, is this idea of leadership and going back to the complexity. Why is leadership so complex? Well, at the end of the day, it boils down to relationships. And this is something that as P2 schools, you know this, right? You know about, we talked before about how leadership or how relationships are complex because people are different. We have different strengths. And so our entire strategy is built around how do you empower your students, and also, of course, we don't advertise this, right? But your staff, and you, how do we help everybody build a better ecosystem of relationships in their life? And so when you start thinking about leadership and as it pertains to remote work versus work in person, right? You don't see people, right, in the eyes. You don't get to give them a hug. You don't get to shake their hands. You don't even get to do the elbow bump or any of that stuff right now, right? And so it's tough, right? It's tough to be able to still feel that those relationships are as strong as they were when you saw people in person every day. Okay, but going back to this, why? So why is leadership so hard? Well, because people are complex and relationships are people. And we talk about the complexity of humans and all of our different experiences and all of our different interests and different character strengths and different ways that we approach conflict. And the list goes on and on and on and on about how complicated we are as human beings, right? So why is that relevant? Well, I would say that it's especially relevant right now, because while they were complex before this, the COVID-19 times have just added fuel to the fire, right? It has increased the complexity of our relationships. Number one, because we can only see in person, right? Or this past period of time, but even now until the end of the school year, right? We're only able to see people, a select number of people in person. We know that we handle, objectively, the data shows we handle conflict better when we're in the same room or when we're sitting there with people, right? Conflict is a lot harder to deal with virtually and remotely. So the list goes on here about how these, the COVID times and the isolation from one another has made it more complicated to be able to build relationships and to maintain relationships with people, especially those that we lead. But why? So why do I believe that leaders right now should explicitly focus on the relationships? Why should you, especially if you're principal, counselor, teacher, whoever you are, why is this arguably more important than ever for you to kind of lean in on those relationships and check in on people and do that? Well, positive relationships fuel a whole lot of things, especially in this remote environment, right? So trust, we know that, right, without those relationships, and again, to be clear, if it's been 5 or 6 weeks now that you haven't seen, a lot of, the people that work for you, and spent time there, trust, you can see how this gets hard, right? Sometimes you saw each other all the time. You just had that trust that you knew where people were going to be during a certain school day. And so now, you might have to work a little extra hard on that. Number two, the accountability, having those hard conversations, right? Positive relationships set the conditions for you to have those hard conversations without taking it personal. You might have seen a quote by James Clear, author of Atomic Habits: not taking things personal is a superpower, right? It's this idea that we so often without that relationship there, we take things personal. And then once you get beyond there, you've got a strong relationship, you can have those hard conversations with people a lot more effectively because people don't take things as personal, right? Because they know that there's a relationship there and that you care about them. Right? And when we think about the well-being, those positive relationships that are critical, they help to fuel, right, well-being. And so, like, even though it's virtual, and even though you might be seeing people like on the computer screen, right, or talking to them on the phone, it's not the same as in person. Like, this is still a fact that our well-being and our happiness and our life satisfaction is still largely determined by the quality of our relationships. Resilience, when you think about, like, how do you help your staff? How do you help your colleagues after they've had a tough day, right? After there's been, like, I saw, last week, right, the news came out, hey, school's canceled for the year. Like how do you respond to those, challenging situations? I like to say there's no resilience pill. You don't just take a pill like, I'm going to be resilient now, I'm just going to pull myself through this. Like, it doesn't work that way. Our relationships and our social support is absolutely critical. And we said this on The View, and Jeff and I were on The View, back in March. Like this is a big part about, like, relationships are the fabric that allows us in many ways to be resilient in the face of adversity. And so once again, how you lean in and build those relationships is really, really important to create that sense of resilience and that responding to adversity in a positive way. And lastly, just is this idea of stability, right? Relationships are very, very helpful in that way. So as we think about this as leaders, like, so we talked a little bit about leading yourself first, and about, the noise, and about how we spend our time. So how do we think about strengthening our relationships with the people that we lead in a remote environment? And more broadly, how do we, lead people remotely? So maybe I'll just tell, I got a few stories, and I will open up for questions and see how I can be useful in terms of specific examples that you may have or things on your mind, right? But at Team Red, White, and Blue, our staff, again, 23 distributed across the country. Fortunately, you don't have the challenge of having to worry about time zones. So for us, like, we can't really start, Zooms until 10 or 11 a.m. Eastern, because a couple of our folks are in Oregon, California. And so therefore, right, like, you just can't start, right? So fortunately, like, you have the ability to do that. But a big part of what we have done is number one, been to establish what we call the battle rhythm. And that's perhaps the military in us, right? But, we talk about this on a deployment. There is what is called a combat update brief, or a CUB, that would often take place every night, say like at 9 o'clock after all the day's activities. So I'm not suggesting that you do this every day, but like there's some idea of like what works for you and your staff, of how to establish that battle rhythm so people can get into a bit of a routine. Okay. The increased complexity, as you know, is that a lot of teachers, a lot of staff are juggling both their job, right, with figuring out like how to be teachers, also being parents and helping to educate their children, right? And so that's where the complexity of this really, ramps up. Whereas, for people out there who don't have kids, right? Like, it's still hard for them, but it's hard in a different kind of way, because there isn't as many disruptions and honestly distractions, right, to being able to do your job. There's also the age of your kids. Are your kids in middle school, high school, right? They tend to be more independent. Are they very young, right? So there's all these variables, which goes back to the importance of relationships. It's critical that that each and every one of the people that you lead, that you know about their situation, because that will help you to be able to provide the adequate support that they need based upon their specific situation, right? You cannot apply just, a blanket solution, to doing this. But again, going back to this idea of like the battle rhythm, I think it's key. If you can help people to do that, then they know that, hey, every day at this time, and maybe it's early, maybe it's 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, maybe it's like, at some window of time, and you can gather that information by asking people or by doodles or polls. But if you can find like that ideal time to like sort of level set people, that's one thing. Two, I think it's very important, when we think about the difference between leadership and management. For some of you who joined the call, we talked about Jeremy Mitchell, the principal out in Michigan, who motivated me to do this idea of run 1 mile every hour, for the whole day. But management versus leadership, management is overseeing processes and reports that need to get in and making sure that all the hoops are jumped through. I think it's really important, in this period of time, that leaders lead. And that means that, like, I think it's important to think through, how are you inspiring the people that look to you for guidance and direction and inspiration to pull through these hard times. We are all, to a certain extent, struggling with, not just in our own personal lives, but just like with the sense of like, where do we go from here in the world, right? And so I think it's really important to think hard about, how are you as a leader inspiring the people, right, that are on your team, because they need it. right? We all need it. And so I found inspiration in Jeremy Mitchell, doing this thing. Mike, I don't think Mike Mitchell's on here now, but he did this amazing thing. Like they had this parade all the way through Mechanicsville, New York. And so I see some principals out there and staff doing some amazing things, but I would challenge you to think from a leadership perspective of how are you keeping, your staff inspired? Because and that's why I'm doing this today, not because I want to go run, 1 mile every hour, but to me, this is a part of I look at my staff and I know that they're struggling right now. A lot of them, have been isolated for a long period of time, and it's saying hey, how can we think outside the box and inspire one another? And so it's not just you as the leader inspiring them, but how do we inspire each other? Because that is especially important, at this period of time. So battle rhythms, coming up with, to the very best of your ability, provide some structure for people's day. How do you inspire? And the last thing I'll share, and then I'll stop talking and take some questions if you have them. I think, a big part of this for us is, how do we, have grace, have, a sense of understanding that everybody is kind of going through this challenging time. And again, we spoke to this 2 weeks ago when we talked about a sense of grace, a sense of forgiveness, and understanding that everyone's going through, this adversity, and they're handling it in a different way. Look, leadership still is at the end of the day about accountability. You still have to get things done, right? Those things may be defined for you in terms of end of the year grades, or whether those things happen or not. There's all these variables. So a part about leadership, it is getting the mission accomplished. In the military, kind of talk about, mission first, people always, soldiers always. You need to care about your people and about getting the job done, right? You can't care about one or the other, right? You've got to care about them both, taking care of people, but also taking the hill, or also getting whatever it is that you need to get done, right? And I think that's to me is the final point that I would impress upon you is that is where my mind goes on a lot of this, is you still have to be able to hold people accountable for what they need to do, right? But not to a point of breaking people or adding additional stresses to their life, which is already incredibly complicated by these COVID times. So how do you strike that balance between the accountability and helping people to get done what they need to get done, but also knowing that we are in these unprecedented times, and that makes it very, very challenging, for a lot of us to be able to meet our goals and get our, objectives done and meet our deadlines, just because of all the things that we have coming at us all day long. So with that being said, I'll stop sharing my slides, and would love to hear feedback, questions that you may have based upon everything I shared. By the way, how about that? I took, I think, 2 breaths in about 25 minutes. So just keep rolling.
I'll just give a little bit of feedback for something that I've tried to work on for myself. I'm Tiffany. I work at the Positivity Project. Sorry, I probably should have said that. But I'm also working full time like you all are, and I have 2 kids at home, 2 different grade levels. So one of the things that I did to kind of help my team see what's going on and where I'm most available is I put on my calendar the times that I'm doing homework with my kids, the times that it's lunch, the times that I'm taking a walk. Those times that I reserve for myself and my family to make sure that I'm showing up equally for both has been a game changer. I know that I block it off. You can't schedule time with me then. If it's critical, yes, you can call, but that way I know that my kids are getting their very best from me, undistracted. And then when it's time to work, that my kids have that expectation of the times we have a family schedule up there. They know when I work versus when they work, when we're all Zooming, when we're eating, when they're playing, whatever it looks like. So I encourage you, if you haven't done that yet, maybe think about trying that, because it sets the expectation for those that you're working with. And it also helps set the expectation for your family of when you're working.
Yeah, absolutely. Battle rhythms. Yeah, they're so key. And again, and then going back to that point about grace, right? And I'm sure that, even Tiffany, who is all over, there's probably some slip ups that happen, right? Oh man, I was supposed to be working right now. And, and so it's that idea of having grace and knowing that hey, when you fall off the bandwagon a little bit, it's all right, get back on it. Right. And that's absolutely critical. Is trying to bring structure to an unstructured world, right? Is really challenging. But again, Tiffany's also an outstanding remote worker. She's been working remotely for quite a number of years now. And again, I was saying this earlier to somebody, but it took me about 18 months to figure it out. Right? Like, you know, and I still haven't got it all figured out, but like to make a lot of progress on this. So I think that people really need to be, you know, assured that, look, you're not going to master this between now and when it's time to come back to school. All right, hopefully in August or September, but how can you follow a couple of these things to the very best of your ability to maximize your efficiency, but also, you know, as you said, Tiffany, to be present, like with family and all those things when you need to as well.
Mike, I had a question. Can you hear me? I'm wondering how you keep track of or keep tabs on who you communicate with, or like whether or not you've checked in with someone in a while. Is there a method to the madness, or is it just serendipitous?
Yeah, no, so that's a great point. So I think that there's got to be a method to the madness. And so for me, like I kind of break my staff down into, right, senior leadership. So I've got a senior leadership team of 5. And then we've got, you know, sort of specialty areas or whatever. And I don't, just because of time is so, you know, stressed right now, like there's so much going on, there's not a whole lot of time for one-on-ones. Right. You can do it. And I think it's key and it's important to assess and to know who needs a one-on-one. But for me, it's really about pods. Right. So I think that like, so I communicate to like my senior leadership team. So if I'm a principal, I think about communicating to, right, hey, all my kindergarten teachers, right, or all my 3rd grade teachers, like in a certain period of time. You know, so number one, like one of the things that we know that often, you know, negativity fills the vacuum, right? When people don't know, they just start assuming bad things, right? Like, hey, why did Mr. Mitchell talk to, you know, one teacher, but not another teacher, right? Like, I think people start assuming those things. So again, making sure that you're, you know, anytime you want to talk to a certain group of people that you do so, you know, very clearly. But that to me is how I think you handle it. Like I don't have like a log or anything like that. And it's also not good to kind of just trust your mind, because with everything going on, like that's putting a lot of confidence and trust in your memory to be able to remember that. And again, it goes back to what Tiffany talked about, like battle rhythms and setting structure to an unstructured world, right? And that just, I can't, not to beat that horse too much, but like that's it. You really have to set that structure there, knowing that even when you do that, you're going to fall off, right? You're going to slip up, but it's the proverbial, you've probably heard the phrase before, like, you know, plans are worthless, but planning is priceless, right? Like that whole idea, no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. Mike Tyson, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face, right? Like all these, like, you know, these cliche sayings that exist out there are real, right? It's not about like, you can have the best plan in the world and then you get out there and things happen. And it's the investment in the structure that allows you to get back to a centered place. So to me, like the structure around how I communicate to people on my staff is absolutely a fundamental part of being able to stay on top of it. By the way, how's your legs feeling after that run the other day, huh?
Yeah, I had some ice on the right knee, but we're good today.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Good.
How are you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good. For those who aren't tracking, Jeremy is the one, as I mentioned before, who motivated this whole idea. He actually shared a documentary of somebody who did this for 24 hours straight, and in between each 1 mile run, like this guy worked on all these like projects around the house. So he basically was like this massive period of like 24 hours of efficiency. So fascinating. What else? What's going on?
I've got a question for anyone on the call. Like, what are the biggest things you're struggling with right now in terms of communicating with staff or communicating with parents or students? Like, if you had to block out what the toughest thing is, what is it? Yeah, go ahead, Todd.
I think one of the biggest struggles as a teacher is trying to prioritize what is most important. What part of the curriculum, what part of the communication with families, what part of the relationships with the students and the families and the administration and our coworkers, like that gentle balance of what is most important per day. And it gets back to that slide that Mike shared, I guess, as far as, you know, the boxes. But I guess some days what is most important might vary. And it depends on who you're talking to or who we're working with, what teacher it is, what administrator, you know, all of those things. But at the end of the day, like sometimes you put your head on your pillow during this situation, and you're like, did I get anything done? And were any of my priorities truly priorities, or was it just that mass chaos that sometimes gets in the way? So that's some days we're all having these great days, like you feel like you're, on top of the world, mission accomplished. And other days, or consecutive days, unfortunately, you face that situation of, man, I'm not as effective as I know I could and should be, and why? So I guess to answer that, sum it up, is just prioritization of what's most important.
Yeah, prioritization. Yeah, and that's so difficult, and we deal with that internally too as a remote team, with being reactive sometimes versus proactive, and it's tough. I think for us, what we've seen is the structure really matters, but at the same time, like, it's a lot more complex for all of you because you have a lot more people, and like Mike said, people are complex, and you have a lot more people, and it goes beyond just coworkers. It's also parents and students. But yeah, so thanks for sharing, Todd.
I kind of echoed.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
I was just going to echo maybe what Todd said, and I think as a school leader right now, it's that not everybody's on the same plane as far as communication methods right now. I think I'm struggling as a school leader with we have some families that, while we can put devices in their hands, they can't get to the school to get them. Whether we take it there, then they may not have internet, or they're struggling to do that, or the structure in the home isn't available to do that. And then we've got, some families that they're rocking it out, and they're craving more. And so there's in this COVID age, there's quite a spectrum of capabilities for people. And so how do you personalize and navigate all that is tough right now, I think.
I would echo what Jeremy said. As a building principal, I think the equity for our students, and then the capacity, right? So what everyone's capacity during COVID time is, adults, kids, families, for a variety of reasons, and then balancing that with the equity needs. It's nobody needs or wants or, can handle the same thing. So it's figuring that out remotely, and then it's being able to have grace and accept what everyone's best is where they're at, but with an accountability piece that, we still want kids to know some stuff when they come back in the fall.
Yeah, just jumping on that, Dan. I mean, that gets into the bread and butter of this, right? That again, you can have accountability and grace. Like, it's possible. I think that we've gotten into this place, like in our country, a lot of times we kind of feel like it's either or, like you're either in this corner or that corner, right? Like, I think it's really is striking that balance between the two. But realizing just how complicated and difficult it is to strike that. And that, look, as a leader, especially, you're never going to make everybody happy. As I saw a funny quote, right? Like, if you want to make people happy, sell ice cream. don't go into a leadership role. Like you're going to have to make decisions that are just, everyone's got different situations, and like some people are going to be like, that feels unfair to me, right? Like, right. Unfortunately, you've got the P2 language and can help understand like what fairness is, right? To have that conversation, say like, no, like we are making the decision for the greatest good, for the best interest for the greatest number of our staff, and we know it's not going to please everybody, or it's not going to be optimal for everybody. But to your point, like that's key, because again, this is the reality, right? When we talk about accountability, right, especially in a remote environment. Like, this is critical, because like without the accountability, without the goals, without that structure, like you can just kind of feel like a rudderless ship, right? People still need some of those goals, and some of those, like we at the P2 have the goal, right, of having, 125 schools like re-sign the P2 pledge, right? Like in the month of May, right? You still have goals and objectives that you work towards. And those things, I would argue, they provide that structure, that motivation, that direction of why you're doing what you're doing, right? And then if you fall short, then it's like, okay, look, hey, like we did our best, or what can we learn from, et cetera. But I think it's really important to know that like the accountability, that word has such often like a negative connotation to it. Like, oh, you're holding people accountable. Damn it, I'm tough. Like that's not really what it is. It's trying to have that conversation with people about like, we still need to set the bar for you about what needs to get done, because like we all need those things in our life to keep us sort of on the straight and narrow and keep helping to focus our energy and our efforts.
One thing I wanted to bring up, I'm Juliana West, teacher, middle school, and what I have struggled with, and our whole staff has as well, is those kids that have just gone silent. where we haven't heard anything from them. And we send out the emails and we try to reach out. And then when you finally do, when we're getting down to making those personal phone calls, that accountability piece becomes like a grace piece where you're saying, hey, are you okay? How's everything going? I just wanted to hear that you're okay and that you're healthy. And then the parents start to open up and it becomes like a counseling session. And so just letting them know that we do care and that it's okay. Don't worry about the work that you haven't turned in. Just start from today and make just one step forward. And don't worry about, you can still make up the other assignments, but don't worry about that right now, because I feel like the kids are obviously with their parents, so they're in part of this shared environment where they might share some of the same avoidance structure. And so that feeling of overwhelming them with assignments, and they just feel like they're so far behind it that there's no way they can catch up, it's almost paralyzing. So just telling them, hey, it's okay. We're going to start just right now today. And what can we do? Are you okay, first of all? And if you are, let's figure out a way just to get this next piece done. And so that has been some of the most valuable time I have spent is on the phone with these parents that, those are the ones that might run you down in the car line, when you're having your car duty, and you would have never really had an opportunity to really interact with them on that level. Because I think the first few weeks of this quarantine, people were, having all their little fun, things they were doing. This is great. We're all together. And then, then the crisis starts setting in, and people are really at a point now where we're weeks into this and we don't know when it's all going to turn around. So for some, I think they just feel like they need somebody to throw them that little bit of a sort of a spiritual life raft, and say, hey, it's okay. Just hop on and we'll figure this out and move forward. Because we've got some weeks to go where we need to finish strong and get them kind of back on the boat. So that's all I wanted to say. Just that piece of grace when you said that.
Yeah,
really and that's.
Yeah, as I was going to say, like, it would just trigger just one quick thing to jump on that, is this idea, and I shared this last time about Daniel Kahneman and peak end theory, right? I think what's really important to know is maybe the past 4 to 6 weeks have been messy. Maybe even the next couple of weeks will be messy, but I think that it's really critical to think about how the year ends, and how that momentum or not carries its way into the summer and then into the preparation, not just for your students, but also for your staff, right? So I think that there's a lot of understanding of the messiness and the challenges, certainly to this point. But I think it's really critical to kind of set a high bar for yourself and for the people that you lead to finish strong. And if that means thinking outside the box a little bit or doing whatever, because how, the research shows how the students and staff will certainly remember, does the year end in a fizzle? Or does it end in a positive, affirmational way that gives some hope, when we get back to normal, semi-normal, right, in August, September, we're starting from a good place and a positive energy place versus not.
I'm just going to jump out here real quick. I'm Diana from Grand Blanc area, so I see some of my Grand Blanc people on here. But when we were talking about structures and autonomy, I think we started off thinking, oh, this is awesome. Our teachers are going to have autonomy. They're excited. They're doing different and new and innovative things. And then we had to reel back in as a team and say, actually, they're looking for a little more structure. So it's that interesting balance of knowing your people, like you had mentioned. You can send out an email with a crisis in a family, and hey, best case scenario would be let's have some grace and do this for the family, and you get the teachers that send back a message that says perfect, great, we got it, and the next teacher sends back 15 questions. How do we code this? How do we do this? Where do we put this? So it's balancing that grace and also knowing the people that you're working with, but that autonomy and structure and your people, and it's messy.
Yeah, and I think that's why I spent so much time on those slides up front, Diana, talking about that messiness, and not necessarily just to reassure and to reaffirm that, but to say that that's I would be concerned if it wasn't messy, right? In an environment like this, and that's where, going back to the previous talks, right? Simplify and structure All right. And it's not enough to just obviously hear it in a 45-minute conversation with people. Like, this is hard work. Like, the actual hard work here that has to be done now follows, you know, a conversation here. But yeah, it's absolutely critical to try to simplify some of these things, and then also provide that structure and that guidance, because, you know, in an ambiguous environment like we're operating in, people do want structure. Most people, right? They do want to essentially be told, hey, what can I do? Right? What should I not do? Like, so I think thinking hard through that, you know, in these coming weeks is really important to do that, to describe, you know, to be able to address just what you just talked about there.
And Diana, one thought on that we do a lot, because we get a lot of similar questions coming into us from partner schools or potential partner schools, but essentially categorizing them and then trying to come up with standard ways that, you know, we can respond. And we always personalize everything, and we make sure it directly answers the person's question. But there's also a lot of stuff that we know we're going to get repeatedly. So having that standardization, and I think, like, you've only had it however many weeks, you know, 5-7 weeks now, but maybe there might be certain things that you see coming over and over again that you can have that standard response or that standard checklist for those teachers to use.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, and like I said, everything that you guys are dealing with as educators is way more complex than what we're dealing with. So these are just ideas that we're throwing out, but we totally recognize that you guys have very complex leadership challenges right now.
And looking ahead for next year, is any districts on the line? Are you guys talking about possible rollout plans or plans for reopening? Are any of you on teams or committees that are doing that?
Hi, everybody. Danielle from Baldwinsville, New York, lucky enough to be a district level director with accountability in my title. So you made me laugh a little bit there, Mike. But yeah, we have just started, you know, thinking about what that's going to look like. Our governor just announced that we'll be out for the rest of the academic year, and summer school still unknown. And so what we've started to do as district leaders is work with our building principals, really thinking about like 3 different buckets, so to speak. So what are we doing with our students, for our parents, and within our community? But then within each of those, considering what are the academic needs of our students, how do we improve the communication about academic needs with parents, but looking at different community supports as well. Looking at social emotional needs, that's going to be, you know, more important now as ever. But then looking at the health and safety needs too. I think as educators, we're more comfortable with the academic and the social emotional than the health and safety piece. So we're really going to be relying on our school nurses and our school nurse supervisor to help us with that. But, you know, all of those questions about masks and social distancing, and how do we, you know, if we have to come back at a place where we're teaching our kindergartners that they have to stay distant from one another, just how do we tackle some of those challenges in addition to the academic piece of it all too.
Just to piggyback on what Danielle was saying, I'm Allison. I also work with Diana and Jeremy and Grand Blanc. And I can see 4 of us who are on this call who are all part of the committee of people who are helping to figure out what we're going to do next year. And so many of those things, I think my biggest struggle right now is just being able to pull, I guess, the opinions or the information from all the different people that we need to be able to talk to. You know, our committee right now is just made up of administrators, but we need to be able to get input from teachers and from parents and from students and from our nurse and from our food service people, you know. And so I think that's our biggest struggle, is that, Mike, earlier you said, you know, you're gonna have to make decisions and you aren't gonna be able to make everybody happy. And I think that it's important always to think about decisions that you have to make and decide, is this something I can make on my own, or do I have to ask other people for their input? And in this environment, it's just so hard sometimes to get that input, because sometimes we have to make quick decisions. And sometimes, you know, it's just hard because we're in an environment where all we can do is Zoom, and there are so many different people that we need to get input from. So I think that's where I'm struggling the most, is just how to get a hold of all those people and how to give them a voice, because teachers are scared right now. We sent out a survey last week just asking how they're doing, and the continuous comment I got was, I'm worried about what's going to happen next year. I don't like not knowing where we're going to be next year. So being able to give them that voice too, that's authentic, and that they feel like they're having an input and know what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's such an important point. You know, again, it's that balance between obviously giving people a voice, right, and kind of hearing what's on their mind, because like that's leadership, right? Especially the positive psychology definition of it's really being able to like analyze other people. You know, I think that the key part becomes like, you know, looking at that tension between like what decisions need to be made in the short term, and what times like do you like allow decisions to drag out and out and out, you know, because you're trying to consensus build, and that in that valuable 2 weeks of time when you could have made the decision, you drag it out, right? And like, what's the cost to that, right? To the mental health, right? From a security standpoint, to the average person, right? On down. So again, this is the complexity of it. And, you know, again, I keep going back to the importance of like solitude, reflection, thinking, leading yourself first in these moments, because you need to be able to spend as a leader. If all you're doing all day long is going back and forth, you're sitting on Zooms, right? Well, look, we're on a Zoom right now, right? This is great. But like, if you're not spending time thinking or journaling out your thoughts and your ideas and your frustrations and your challenges, and like more than ever now, leaders need to be thinking, right? And not just having conversations, like getting inside, you know, their minds. Like, I think this is arguably more critical than ever, because you need to have the optimal clarity to know what decisions you need to make that are time sensitive without the input from other people. Like, this is the decision that we need to make for our school, for our kids, versus the ones that you need to, you know, to really consensus build and get input. And right, that's just obviously way more, you know, way more effort, right? You know, way more time, way more stress, you know, so it is a real tough balance to hit there, and you're never going to get it just right. And that gets back to the idea of, again, leading with grace, you know, and knowing that like sometimes, and also asking for it from other people, saying like, look, some decisions, and I tell these people this as a leader all the time, like whether it's in my house, like my wife and I, sometimes we make decisions, like, and we just say, hey, one of us is making the call, we go. Right. Like, and sometimes it doesn't turn out great. Then like you kind of eat that and you say, look, my bad. Like, I made the decision with the best information I had at the time. Right. But one of the worst things that we can do, especially in a volatile environment, is to drag things out for too long. Right. And I know that like big decisions, like, you know, summer school and like how do, like, these are huge things, and you need input, you need consensus, but there's a lot of other decisions I think that you don't, or I should say that the time that it takes for you to build consensus is actually eating into other people's time, right? And so just knowing like what ones do you need that input from and what ones do you not, that's hard, but like you can only get there by getting inside your own mind and thinking and analyzing. All right, well, I got to get ready to jump because I got 7 minutes here to get my next mile in, and I can hear my wife inside lecturing the kids about bad manners. So got to work on those character strengths in the Irwin household every day, every day, all of us.
Hey guys, can I take another picture with everybody smiling that showed up today? All right. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. And the next time you guys see me, I might have a bit of a mohawk. We'll see if it comes true or not. But seriously, like in what Jeff said, like, you know, huge amounts of respect and gratitude, and just with everything you all are leading through. It's history will have a lot of powerful books and stories to be told about, you know, like what you've been doing here on the front lines of the education system for our kids. So thanks a lot for all your hard work, and, you know, great to be able to see you and for making the time today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks everybody.
Jeremy, good to see you. Brett, thanks everybody.